Good evening and welcome to the virtual Einstein Forum. My name is Franziska Bomsky and I would like to welcome tonight's guests. First, Matthew Handelman from Michigan State University, who will give a talk on The Rest is Silence on mathematics and critical theory. This is a very complex subject which touches many different disciplines, and so it was not that easy to find a competent discussion partner for Matthew Handelman. And so I'm more than delighted that we could win Nina Engelhardt for this. Also a very warm welcome to you. Nina Engelhardt is right now an interim professor at the Department of English Literature at the University of Cologne. One of her many research interests focuses on sciences, especially mathematics and literature. She holds a PhD from Edinburgh University. Her thesis was published in 2018 at the Edinburgh University Press and deals with modernism, fiction, and mathematics. Before we start, let me add the usual technical comment for our audience. If you've registered for this event and participating via Zoom, you can and you are more than invited to join in the discussion. And you can do this by writing down your questions in the F&A or Q&A function at the right bottom of your desktop. And you can do this in English or in German, since Nina Engelhardt and Matthew Handelman are both fluent in both languages, and they will then choose in which language to answer. So that's enough from me. I'm very much looking forward to the talk and to a lively discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Franziska Bomsky, for this introduction, and thank you too for the invitation to be here today. And technology based on mathematics, on algorithms that make our computers work, for example, enable us to meet today, even if many of us might prefer a more direct and maybe more human way of connecting. And the threats and benefits of mathematics and of the digital are topics that tonight's talk and discussion might address. It's my pleasure now to introduce Matthew Handelman. He's Associate Professor of German at Michigan State University, and his research is focused on the relationship among critical theory, mathematical thinking, and the digital humanities. And usually in a brief introduction, such as this one, I would not go as far back as a speaker's bachelor degree. But in this case, and in view of the talk that is to follow, I do want to do so and say that Matt holds a BA in German literature as well as in mathematics. He then specialized in Germanic languages and literatures, but it's clear that he continued and continues his mathematical interest and expertise, not least in his book, which I'm holding up, The Mathematical Imagination on the Origins and Promises of Critical Theory, a book which appeared with Fordham University Press in 2019. And in this book and in numerous further publications in international journals, Matt examines German Jewish literature and philosophy in the early 20th century, the intersections of science, mathematics, and culture, and the digital humanities and history of technology. And Matt will introduce us to some of these ideas in these areas tonight. I'll take my cue from Matt's title now, The Rest is Silent. I'll end this introduction now, I'll be silent, and I look forward to hearing Matt speak about The Rest is Silence on mathematics and critical theory.
Thank you. Thank you, Franziska, and thank you, Nina, for the very nice introduction. I am streaming from multiple computers, so if you see me looking around like this, it just means that I'm looking up at the PowerPoint or looking down at the forum, the Zoom forum. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to Franziska for the invite. Thanks to Nina for the moderation. I look forward to the conversation as well. This paper actually is an ongoing conversation that started in, to a certain extent, in a conference in 2009 that Franziska organized in Freiburg on dialogue between mathematics and non-mathematical disciplines. and has clearly taken on some different forms and expanded a little bit, but is still sort of wrestling with a key set of the ideas that were expressed there. So I will start today with a quote from a foundational text in critical theory, Dialectic of Enlightenment. And yeah, I'll just read it. So by sacrificing thought, which in its reified form is mathematics, machinery, organization, avenges itself on a humanity forgetful of it, enlightenment forfeited its own realization. This is the image of mathematics that we inherit from Horkheimer and Adorno. There's a few points here. Many will recall Francis Bacon as a symbol of quality reduced to quantity in the text. But in dialectics, major point, the reasons return to barbarism, mathematics, as he says, as written here, exemplifies Enlightenment's forfeiture of its own realization. In one of the modern returns to myth, in that it creates new taboos and new rituals of modern society. Here, thought reified into quantities and equations are just another means of exercising power and serving capital, as well as dominating nature, in a process that ultimately estrains reason from itself. In this narrative, scientific advancements from modernity, from many of which were mathematical, from Newton to Bertrand Russell, were less pathways to emancipation and more the machinery of rationalization and oppression wielded by industry and totalitarianism. By 1944, this dynamic was personal, in the sense that authoritarianism had by then sent many members of the Frankfurt School, including Horkheimer and Adorno, into exile, or had led to their death, such as Walter Benjamin. And here we see mathematics get gobbled up as an instrument of social control, and anyone who hoped to fashion society with its help only supported the spread of authoritarianism. So for Horkheimer and those who followed in their critical paradigm after the war, mathematics, and those who advocated modes of mathematics, modes of thought that drew on mathematics, were complicit in the European catastrophe and the attempted destruction of the European Jews. So today I want to reconstruct this narrative and challenge it as the only image of mathematics available to critical theory. And I have two theses here, two major points. And the first thesis is that Horkheimer and Adorno's pre-war polemics against logical positivism, which was a rival philosophical movement at the time, connected math with a form of political quietism and conservatism that they saw as aiding fascism. This dispute subsumed math in a largely much different political narrative and erased it as a possible intellectual ally for critical theory. The second thesis is that an alternative origins for mathematics in the critical project lies with the journalist and later film theorist, friend and mentor to the Frankfurt School, Siegfried Kracauer. There he is. For Kracauer, geometry mediated logic and materiality in ways that informed cultural critique, and much of this was in his work in the Frankfurter Zeitung. He also became famous for film, showed how the geometry showed how the material products of mass culture, such as detective novels and dance reviews, illuminated the problematic course of modernity. And in Kracauer's essays during the Weimar period, we see the geometric method of projection offer a literary and aesthetic strategy that revealed and confronted readers with the deleterious logic of capitalist rationality. We'll explore that idea in depth as we go on. My point here, though, is that we can learn from Kracauer, not to mathematicize critical theory, but rather so that critical theory can better engage with the mathematical and computational processes to reveal and critique the digital present. And to a certain extent, this aligns with Kracauer's own work on film, in which film has this potential. And I want to say we can extend it also to looking at digital processes. A bit of background on critical theory, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Here I'm speaking primarily of sort of the early phases of critical theory, known best as the Frankfurt School, which I define broadly here. And here I'm talking about Max Horkheimer, Theodor W. Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Leo Löwenthal, but also Walter Benjamin, Georg Lukács, Kracauer himself. This school started in Weimar, Germany, continued in exile, and returned to West Germany after the war. I mean, it's an important strand of social and cultural theory of the 20th century, with major themes including totalitarianism, as we see here. That was not planned to coincide exactly like that, but anti-Semitism, the unity of theory and praxis, aesthetics, and popular culture, such as film, jazz, and other forms of mass entertainment. And there are two important ideas that I'm drawing on here. The first is Walter Benjamin's orientation of the critical project around the quote linguistic nature of knowledge. And two, Lukács's idea of that there's a contradiction between the quantitative and mathematical economic forms and the material qualities of everyday life. And Horkheimer and Adorno, in their criticism, put their finger on the mismatch between mathematics and language, as well as experience. They tend to reduce and restrict mathematics to the unfree side of the dialectics of freedom and restraint, and thus remove it from the critical project. This is a limited outlook on mathematics. This has limited the outlook on mathematics to that of instrumentalization and devitalization of reason, which is, to be sure, an important element of any attempt to critically address contemporary society, but leaves us few tools to deal with an ever more mathematicized world. And here I'm thinking, as Nina said, algorithms, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I think that Kracauer helps us tell a different story about mathematics and critical theory. Geometry, the intersection of logic and materiality for him, reveals the aesthetic power of cultural critique. We get a more robust version of critical theory if we push back the origins of the critical project to the tumult of the Weimar Republic and catch glimpses here of a theory that can be both mathematical and critical without reducing it to either of those two sides. So a brief roadmap of what I will be talking about here. I'll start obviously with and explore the Frankfurt School's conflict with the Vienna Circle in the 1930s and 40s. It's a very contingent moment where math is written out of the critical paradigm. Then I'll push back the clock to the 1920s to a productive moment of transfer between geometry and the geometric method of projection and cultural critique. And conclude with what this tells us both historically about critical theory and about critical theory's contemporary relevance. And like I've said, my hope is that we'll be better able to deal with the mathematical digital present if we return to unpack and work through the intellectual rivalries of the past. So part one. Here, I'm turning back the clock to the 1930s, exploring the origins of critical theory's antagonism to mathematics. And these arose in the brief yet intense dispute with logical positivism over the correct direction of modern thought. And this actually unfolds throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but I'm focusing on the early version of what would become known as the positivism debate in the 1930s. Logical positivism is the philosophy of the Vienna Circle, also known as logical empiricism, which I think better captures the type of knowledge that they are working to set up, which is that knowledge must be verifiable and or derived logically. Relations between the Vienna Circle and the Frankfurt School began friendly with proposed collaborations between Otto Neurath and Max Horkheimer, two major figures of each circle, with a possible project on empirical sociology. And ultimately, if you look at it, there's a lot in common between the two groups. Many studied under the same professors. Their work at the time and before the rise of the Nazis was understood as quote unquote Jewish. And by 1937, they were both in exile. Any relations between the two soured quickly with Horkheimer's polemical essay, The Latest Attacks on Metaphysics, published in 1937. And here, as Horkheimer would write to Adorno, he characterizes, in so many words, the logical positivists as a, quote, pathetic rearguard action undertaken by the formalistic epistemology of liberalism, which in this area, as in others, turns into open advocacy of fascism. So Horkheimer argues that logical positivism's major claim to knowledge, or major claim that knowledge is empiricism and logic, is itself a non-verifiable and metaphysical position, which contradicts major tenets of its own program, contradiction itself being against the logical positivist program. This attack is multifaceted and complicated, including a response by Neurath to Horkheimer's essay that they refused, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung refused to publish. Andrea Albrecht and Martin Prager have recently published a very interesting article about this in the Zeitschrift für Ideengeschichte. So the attack is multifaceted and complicated. But we see here that math, and specifically knowledge reduced to mathematics, transform into the motor in the rise of fascism and the return of enlightenment to myth. And so we might ask ourselves at this point, why does the Frankfurt School care? Here I'm going to go through some of these points, but I'm largely understanding the logical positivism through their text, The Scientific Conception of the World, which lays out their anti-metaphysical and appoints people would describe as anti-philosophical philosophy, which they then directly oppose to what they call German idealism, in that it knows only, and this is an important only for Horkheimer and Adorno, empirical statements about objects of all kind and the analytic statements of logics and mathematics. Analytic statements here, of course, in the Kantian sense. And so this basically limits, the basic view of this is that it limits knowledge to experience recorded by the scientist in the laboratory, and the logical manipulation of these so-called protocol sentences. For logical positivism, the point here was to free knowledge from the messiness of historical language and to analyze it through logical analysis. It's also to exclude from science any non-verifiable and metaphysical claims, which they then describe as the stuff of poetry or myth, Dichtung oder Mythos. And of course, this rejection of myth as knowledge, it can be seen within the context of the early Nazi period as a point of delegitimizing that type of knowledge itself. This included moving away, more specifically within philosophy, moving away from thinkers like Hegel and methods like dialectics. It can be captured perhaps best in Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous quote, which I sort of paraphrase here. The world is the totality of the facts. Of facts, whatever can be said clearly. And of course, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. And the Frankfurt School saw this as an attack on dialectics and aesthetics and other modes of philosophical expression that they found to be central parts of any project of knowledge, but that they also saw it as a competing vision of philosophy. If you look at the correspondences and the materials surrounding this debate, the attack and the polemics and the tone of the polemics really revolves around personal and institutional rivalries, anxieties over positions and influence in the United States, and a largely unclear academic future for these two types of philosophy in the 1930s. And as I said, you can read about this in Albrecht and Prager's work, as well as in Hans-Joachim Dahm's Positivismusstreit. So Horkheimer and Adorno's criticism of logical positivism attacks many points, but especially, and this is what I'll focus on here, their logical positivism's interpretation of language. And Horkheimer and Adorno take issue with two major language-related ideas that they associate with logical positivism. The first is the translation of logic into mathematics, which is known as mathematical logic or Logistik in German of the time. Obviously, that has a different meaning today. And this, the key people here are Bertrand Russell and Whitehead's work on mathematical logic, as well as Gottlob Frege's. The second is the equation of language with mathematics as a medium of logic, what they refer to as logical analysis. And I'll give an example of this because it's kind of hard to understand for those who are unfamiliar with it, what exactly we're talking about here. An example from George Boole's Laws of Thought from the middle of the 19th century. Regarding the principle of what he calls contradiction, we know today as the principle of non-contradiction. And we can express this in words in English as it is impossible for any being to possess a quality and at the same time not to possess it. We can also express this with algebraic symbols as x times 1 minus x equals 0. And I'd like to unpack this, at least my understanding of it. I'm sure there are people in the chat right now who are or in the Zoom right now that would be better explaining this. But so just to talk through it, x here equals inequality. I'm sorry, this was within the rules of algebra that Boole defines to be consistent with formal logic. So x equals inequality. 1 minus x equals the opposite of x, so not x. Multiplication is the logical operation of and 0 means false. So the class, or it's false that the logical statement inequality and the opposite of that quality. And here. This leads Horkheimer and Adorno to a few key points, which especially gets played out in their letters as well as in Horkheimer's essay. And here I want to just remind everybody that for Benjamin, language was more than just its ability to communicate. And for Lukács, experience and the qualities of life are more than sort of the mathematical quantitative forms of economics. And these are building blocks that Horkheimer and Adorno are working with here. They uphold, as Adorno puts it, quote, the principal difference between logic and mathematics. And they argue that logical positivism is wrong and that it eliminates, so Horkheimer, quote, the linguistic structure in which the interaction of thought and experience is expressed, which is its mode of presentation or style. So it's wrong because it takes out the interaction of thought and experience, which is mode of presentation or style. And so it fails to account for the materiality of language as representation, the relationship between sign and meaning, and style, the relationship between words in a sentence and sentence in our text. And for them, logical positivists, for Horkheimer and Adorno, logical positivism is also dangerous in that it forfeits critical or historical dimension, the critical or historical dimension of thinking. And it does this, of course, for Horkheimer and Adorno when this critical faculty of thought is most needed. I want to focus on Horkheimer and Adorno's idea of this political danger, but note to begin with that this was an especially strong accusation for the logical positivists, many of whom were avid anti-fascists and who, as I mentioned earlier, were also in exile for their political views by 1937. So the idea of this political danger is that there's a disconnect between thought and its material expression. And Adorno will return throughout his career to this, to indignation of mathematics separation of thought and expression, and turn Wittgenstein's famous quote Inside Out, saying that he wants to make logic speak. But it's really Horkheimer who captures the political dimension best. So and I'm reading from a letter here, the logical positivist identification of this abstract moment of exactitude, which upon closer inspection turns out to be its opposite, with the concept of truth as such, is only the transfigurations of the silence of these latest liberals. With it, they help sanction and spread the horror that through their totalitarian successors has come over the world. This contemporary philosophy does mathematics, the rest is silence. So diese Philosophie treibt Mathematik, der Rest ist Schweigen. So Hamlet's last words, the rest is silence, point to the moment where doing mathematics becomes subsumed in this attack on logical positivism, and assigned the role of falling silent in the face of the very real horror of Nazism. We see the evolution here, the idea that language is more than just communication from Benjamin, that life is just more than economics, or formal quantitative forms of economics and Lukács. Then the political life of political and ethical life is greater than mathematical reasoning for Horkheimer and Adorno. And this is a striking condemnation. If thought remains bound to what Horkheimer and Adorno would describe as the status quo, and mathematics, then it, at least in theory, remains silent about the collapse of liberal democracy and the rise of its totalitarian successors. So math is a silent tool of oppression. This is the image that reappears in canonical texts of critical theory, especially in a text like Dialectic of Enlightenment. Here it joins, as I mentioned, Bacon, Francis Bacon, but also Odysseus as a personification of reason's regression to barbarism. And in dialectic, one comes across lightly veiled attacks or references to logical positivism, this new logic, etc., that, according to the text, limit thought to mathematics and deny all else. And Horkheimer and Adorno interpret this, as I mentioned, as the taboos and the new rituals of mathematical thinking. Take one example. I'm combining a few different quotes here, but quote, mathematical formalism arrests thought at mere immediacy, and knowledge confines itself to repeating it. If that happens, then, quote, enlightenment regresses to the mythology it has never been able to escape, end quote. And this subsumes mathematics into its theses of reason's entwinement with unreason. So what started then as a conflict between philosophical circles became a meta-history of reason, where knowledge reduced to mathematics became a major agent in the return to myth and its barbarism, genocide of the previous century. And I want to close this section with two important points. I'm not saying that Horkheimer and Adorno have nothing to say about the subject of quantification, of mathematics and philosophy, mathematics and thought. And they indeed attune us to the incongruencies between mathematics and thinking. And we see many similar points today in some of the work that has come out on algorithms and ideas of machine learning, such as Cathy O'Neill's well-known Weapons of Math Destruction. But this animosity towards mathematics and critical theory was long-lasting and went beyond just this phase of the critique of instrumental reason. Indeed, Habermas describes communicative reason in distinction, I hear echoes from the 1930s, in distinction to deductive formal logic as non-deductive, explicitly, quote, informal logic. And well, this is an important move, obviously, for Habermas. What I worry about is that it leaves the world of formal reasoning uncritiqued. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to take a sip of water and turn back the clock even further to the 1920s, where Kracauer is a cultural critic working at the feuilleton of the Frankfurter Zeitung. And for him, mathematics, and especially geometry, illuminated the divergence of life and meaning caused by large-scale capitalism, rationalization, and mass culture, many of the traditional woes of classical modernity. One of the parallels I want to set up here is that geometry acts a lot like film and photography for Kracauer, and that it mediates between these dual regions of thought and materiality. And geometry means various things. For Kracauer, however, it meant specifically Euclidean geometry, which is, of course, a model of well-ordered reasoning, and has been within Spinoza and through up into the formalism debates of the early 20th century, in which axioms through deductive reasoning lead to theorems. But for Kracauer, geometry also means descriptive geometry, in German darstellende Geometrie, which is the mode of practical drafting techniques that architects use. And of course, Kracauer was first trained as an architect. And here he focuses in on the method of projection, which maps a 3D structure onto a 2D plane. You see this here in the image. For Kracauer, as his mathematics professor put it, projection allows us to imagine a convoluted figure intuitively. And so geometry combined the rule-bound and necessity of logic with the contingency of experience. And I want to argue here that this combination comes to inform Kracauer's analysis of mass culture, and that this analysis actually offers us an alternative to Horkheimer and Adorno's polemics against math. The main idea here, then, is that geometry helped shape Kracauer's aesthetic program for cultural critique, where literary composition of the text turned into an intervention in modernity. And geometry, as the confluence of logic and materiality here does not show political impotence, but rather the interpretive power which Kracauer assigns to it in texts such as his 1925 treatise on the detective novel, which was only published after his death in the 1970s. As Kracauer argues, detective novels offer us a Zerspiegel, a distortive mirror that shows the dreadful state of affairs of civilization and rationality. And Kracauer borrows here on Kierkegaard as a metaphysical model, or on Kierkegaard's metaphysical models, with a lower sphere, with reality constituted as a lower sphere of the rational civilized world that stands in contradistinction to a higher religious sphere. Kracauer writes, the ensnarled knowledge and behaviors of the lower regions have equivalents in the higher spheres. The message that such lower knowledge and behaviors bring depicts in essentially something essential. It is first their projection onto the very contents that they distort that makes the distorted images transparent. If their meaning is to be freed from the depths, then they are to be transformed until they reappear metamorphosed in the coordinate system of the higher region of spheres, where they may be examined to determine their meaning. Now, this passage is difficult, but there's clear mathematical valence in the terms projection in coordinate system. Projection, of course, also having a whole bunch of other meanings, but I take this idea of the Koordinatensystem to really be an important idea for Kracauer, as well as what he calls, in general, this idea of Projektionslehre, theory of projection, which is the name that is used in many of the sort of lay textbooks on projection that Kracauer may have come into contact with. And the idea here is that projection is an interpretive device to read meaning in material objects of mass culture. So in mathematics, projection maps 3D objects, such as the house that we see here, onto a 2D plane, the square with the top, which is basically the top view of the house. And Kracauer here runs projection in reverse. He projects the impoverished two-dimensional shape back into its three-dimensional form. That is, he reads in the flat rationalized world its equivalence in the metaphysics of modernity, where it can be transformed and critiqued. And in the text, in Kracauer's analysis of detective novels, we see these types of projections where the rationality of the detective in the stories is akin to, in the religious sphere, the function of the priest. The polis corresponds to the divine law. And the often tidy endings of detective novels are sort of an ironic reflection of the eternal deference, or eternal deferral of the messianic end. And one of the most famous examples of the course is Kracauer's, is the hotel lobby, which has its Gegenbild in the church, in the house of God. And the comparison reveals the anonymity, the fragmentation, and disintegration of modern society, in contrast to the supposed fullness of religious community. And we can disagree here with Kracauer's metaphysics, but the idea is key, and it's key for Kracauer, that we can read mass culture's aesthetic creations, ästhetische Gebilde, as he said, and that as material creations, they emerge out of and reflect the logic of their own production. And here we see this connection between between logic and materiality. I want to bring this into a larger picture for Kracauer, where projection thus was the possibility of reading and critiquing a dreadful state of affairs. And this takes on a political assignment for him. Many are familiar with the text The Mass Ornament, which which is published 2 years after the detective novel, and picks up and expands projection as a method. And many of us are familiar with this. The Mass Ornament are the British dance review of the Tiller Girls, or mass sporting events, in which the capitalist capitalist rationalization serves as a model of, the Mass Ornament serves as a model in which we can see the loss of individuality and community. And the Mass Ornament redeploys and rebrands the idea of projection. I'm not going to go into specifics, but say that it comes in the mass ornament as the famous idea that we can express an epoch's place in the larger scheme of history through its, quote, surface level expressions, end quote. And of course, here Kracauer is referring to spirits, film, dance reviews, etc. There's also here a political shift that's important. There's no longer the narrative of a higher sphere. Rather, in the mass ornament, history is conceived as a dynamic process. And here capitalism is only one stage of this process, characterized by a stagnant, a murky, a getrübte Vernunft, a murky version of reason, which produces gratifying patterns but dehumanizes the actors or dancers. And together, we take projection in the detective novel as a social mirror. This turns in mass ornament into a critique with a political task. And we see this political task in the famous directive at the end of the mass ornament. Quote, the process of social change leads directly through the center of the mass ornament, not away from it. End quote. And I think the idea here is that projecting and then confronting readers with the mass ornament would push murky reason into critical reflection. This is exactly what Siegfried Kracauer sought to do with the help of projection in his 1920s feuilletons. So at this point, I want to take a closer look at one of Kracauer's feuilletons as a site of transfer between mathematics and cultural critique. So as I've mentioned before, for Kracauer, film and photography were sites of the confrontation with effects of modernity. But I think that this confrontation is also staged in his own writing in the feuilleton for the Frankfurter Zeitung, and is done so via projection as a literary form. I want us to consider here one of the two urban miniatures included in the text Two Plains, which is published in 1926, which is a depiction of Marseille's old harbor called the Bay. These two texts are packaged in geometric terms. Verflache obviously has a mathematical valence here, and they were republished in the 1960s under the heading Lead in Natural Geometry. So the first plane, and here I'm going to show a picture of Marseille's harbor and read the text, and I'll show the text as I analyze it in a second. So the first text, the bay, begins, Marseille, a dazzling amphitheater, arises around the rectangle of the old harbor. Each one like the next, rows of facades fringe the three shores of the area paved by the sea, whose depth cuts into the city. Across from the entrance to the bay, the Cannebière, the street of all streets, breaks into its smooth luminescence, carrying the harbor further into the city's interior. It is not the only connection between the soaring terraces and this monster of a square, from whose fountain the neighborhoods rise like the jets of a fountain. To the square point churches as the vanishing point of all perspectives, and the yet uncovered hills face it as well. Such an audience has rarely been assembled around an arena. If ocean liners were to fill the basin, their trails of smoke would drift to the most remote houses. If fireworks were to be set off over the plain, the city would be witness to the illumination. And we see here throughout the passage and throughout the text itself a distinct contrast between, on the one hand, the emptiness of the old harbor in the age of modern capitalism, and we see here a picture of from the 1930s, obviously, in the color picture. It has been retaken by as a marina. So we see on the one hand the emptiness of the old harbor versus, as we see in the text, the kaleidoscope of people and life left over from the pre-industrial fishing era. And this last sentence really highlights this as the hypothetical, underscores the contrast, as the next one sort of shows this marker of loss. Quote, no ocean liners fill the bay and no fireworks coast down. And as critics such as Miriam Hansen have argued, the audience of churches and hills here produces a peculiar temporality as a ghost-like marker of loss, which we see here in the Kirchen, the unbedeckten Hügel, ein solches Publikum. But I want to draw attention to the formal and aesthetic strategies that enact projection in Kracauer's text. And these, I believe, are designed to bring the reader face to face with the objectification and alienation caused by the stunted, stagnant rationality of capitalism. In the first sentence, then, The first sentence stresses the autonomous products of humans over human labor or thought itself by combining reflexive verbs with inanimate objects. Here, Marseille arises out of the rectangle of the old harbor, baut sich das Recht des alten Hafens auf. Like the mass ornament, the text also swallows humanity. We see here actions being done by things. Marseille builds itself. The harbor has lost its luster, hat sich abgenutzt, and the streets dead end on its banks, laufen sich tot. In the sentence structure, Two Planes emphasizes the dehumanizing effects of rationality by accentuating the very aesthetic and experiential elements that it threatens to destroy. And in the second sentence, we see this with the subject Fassadenbänder and the direct object, den mehr gepflasterten Platz, are separated distinctly from the verb einsäumen. And this produces an effect of alienation from the subject, alienation of the subject from its action. I also like to look at the form of the piece, which appeared first in a newspaper, and the feuilleton, themselves markers of modernity and mass production, and as Karl Kraus famously called the feuilleton, a literary ornament itself. So here we're going through the literary ornament. And that Two Planes was also published on the same page as an installment of series of articles called Paths of Rationalization, which extol the virtues of international industry standards and norms. And you really then get this contrast on the page of the Frankfurter Zeitung itself. With autonomous objects filling space, the alienated subject, and mass production, these aesthetic features project the modern city against the bustling splendor of the bygone fishing era. And they render legible and even palpable the hollowness and the negativity of capitalist rationality. As geometry mediates logic and materiality, then, in Two Planes, the materiality of the text is meant to stimulate thought, not as a mental escape, but as an impetus to imagine a more reasonable future. I want to bring this again back into a larger context for Kracauer, where we see mathematics functioning here within a larger narrative, not of oppression, but actually as an element in a larger cultural political project. The images that we've seen throughout. So in the late 1920s and 1930s, so moving on from these texts, Kracauer increasingly invested his hopes in the idea that cultural critique could intervene in the upheaval of late Weimar society. And this is a continuation of this idea from the mass ornament, where in the 1930s, Kracauer ascribes in a text called The Minimal Demands on Intellectuals, he assigns to the intellect, quote, the dismantling of the mythological, in which the intellect had to demask ideology and put all inherited intentions to the test. And I see projection here within this larger cultural project of reading and demystifying, as reading these intentions in the material objects of modernity, doing this work of demasking and testing. And Two Planes is then a part of a larger critical project that takes place in the daily newspaper, in which the texts are meant to take stock of modernity as a mode of creating reflection about it. I also want to mention in closing here that for Kracauer, this was a particularly Jewish contribution, as he would write in 1947 in New York exile already, that the Jewish contribution to the modern era was, quote, to dissolve all the elements that obstruct the breakthrough and fulfillment of reason, end quote. And in slightly more constrained terms, the Jews have tended to, quote, spread enlightenment with a flashlight, end quote. And I see enlightenment with a flashlight really as a good metaphor for projecting and illuminating the myth of modern capitalism in an effort to dissolve them. So with the rise of fascism in Siegfried Kracauer, we see geometry helping shape cultural criticism as a hope to dismantle myths of the capitalist epoch and intervene in the course of modernity before it slipped into authoritarianism. So for my conclusion here, I want to reiterate the two sides of the argument that I've set up here. The first being how mathematics came to represent the devitalization and instrumentalization and regression of reason to barbarism in early critical theory. And second, on an alternative story for mathematics and critical theory, which I believe we can see in the work of Siegfried Kracauer. and specifically within this pinpointing of the divide and then interplay between logic and materiality and geometry. I have two final conclusions about math and critical theory that I want to talk about as a mode of looking forward to our algorithmic and digital society today. The first is historical, and that is, this is my representation of history here, that there exists a more complex and a more interesting story about mathematics and critical theory, as well as mathematics and the humanities writ large, than we've been led to believe. And I think we've overlooked this to a certain extent because of critical theory's equation of mathematics with unfreedom and instrumentality and its juxtaposition to things like aesthetics and dialectics. And I just want to remind us in closing that this was itself a very constructed antagonism that was waged over the fight over modern philosophy, as well as the intellectual legacies therein. And it's very important to pay attention to the mismatch of mathematics and the qualities of life and politics, as Horkheimer and Adorno argue. But I want to say here that mathematics is concerned with the mediation of language, the materiality, with the relationship between materiality and thought, between the link between the finite and the infinite, in ways that deeply influence both German Jewish thinkers, as we've seen here, as well as modernist thinkers more generally. And we started to see a lot of this in exciting work by Anna Kornbluth, Peter Fenwiss, and Julia Ing, Andrea Albrecht, and of course, Nina and Franziska here on this Zoom. This is not a call back to some unity between mathematics and critical theory or the humanities, but rather with buzzwords like the digital and the quantitative floating around. I think it's important that we recognize that critical theory and the humanities have been in conversations with mathematics much longer than just the advent of the internet, and that we stand to learn something from this longer history of their interaction. My second conclusion is the potential for critical theory that lies in the further engagement with mathematical ideas, as well as mathematics itself. I don't think, oops, sorry, I knew I'd screw that up. I don't think this is necessarily exactly the same as Siegfried Kracauer's work on projection, but what we do in Kracauer is we catch a glimpse of this potential in his thinking about geometry as its own epistemological realm. Sorry. And this illuminated for Kracauer, especially this link between logic and materiality, the way that thought shapes material objects, such as detective novels, and the way the aesthetic materiality can itself generate thought in the context of the feuilleton. And I think this offers a third way between rejectionism of math, some of which we've seen here, and the positivism often associated with digital and with technology writ large. And among other claims of the Frankfurt School's contemporary relevance, which I prematurely brought up here on the screen, but which we all now can look at, I want to add a call for a real and critical, in the Frankfurt School sense, engagement with concepts like quantity, number, data, computation, as well as more complex concepts like algorithm and machine learning. I think we start to see this in Kracauer's work, and we also get hints of it in Adorno's work itself, such as in his later work on Husserl, where he discusses the computer, the Rechenmaschine, is not a simple analogy of the human mind that follows logical laws. Rather, he points to this analogy as a forgetting of the human, that is the social and the subjective contribution of the creation of the computer that makes it a working computer rather than a heap of parts. And this, I think, points to and raises key questions about the very real dialectics of reification that we see going on in the digital world. I think that we've left these concepts too long to the uncritical exponents of the project of instrumental reason. What I'm arguing here is not for a future in which we give critique over to mathematics or the methods of natural science, but rather that we expand the critical project and that we critique the forgotten corners and syntheses of reason and ideas like computation and quantity, not only so that the rest isn't silence, but also because this once silent logic has learned, as in the case of artificial intelligence, how to speak for itself. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation and to questions. I will stop sharing at this point.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this really thought-provoking talk. And I think we have different areas that the discussion could go into the insights into critical theory that you've presented, the image of mathematics that we've seen, or questions then of both of these areas for our digital age and present today. So just maybe to reiterate that you're welcome to post questions both in German and in English, but it's my privilege to make the start here. And to start things off, I want to pick up on a couple of points that Matt just made. And I hope it's okay for you to allow me to begin with a slightly longer question, because I'm coming at these issues from my perspective in literary studies. And I was struck, or couldn't help noticing, that some of the tendencies that you presented in critical theory, we also see in literary fiction at the time. It's not that surprising, I guess, but it just maybe gave a couple of examples there. So one of the things that I noticed, that mathematics appears as a shorthand for damaging rationality, much in the sense that Horkheimer and Adorno then later around the same time formulate as well. To give an example, I'm thinking of D.H. Lawrence here, for example. In one of his novels, he describes a town as having a great mathematical colliery, for example, a mathematical coal mine. And with that metaphor, he immediately establishes math as part of that dehumanizing industrialization and modernization. Or to go a little further back in time and looking at Dostoevsky in Notes from the Underground, he has the narrator state that, I'll look it up, twice 2 is 4 is not life, gentlemen, but it's the beginning of death. So very much in the direction of Horkheimer and Adorno there. And on the other hand, the rationality and certainty of math appears as a saving grace almost in a world that, not least with the beginning Nazism and totalitarianism, has become unpredictable and repressive. So I'm thinking of George Orwell's 1984 here, for example, where Orwell presents math as the last bastion of truth and of certainty. And we see the protagonist, Winston Smith, capitulate after months of torture and then acknowledge that 2 and 2 makes 5. So that gives math, the truth of math marks the last bastion of truth, and his rejection of mathematical truth denotes his recognition or acceptance of his status as a mechanized and depersonalized cog in the machine of the totalitarian system. But I also wondered about a third tendency, and this is where my question is heading. So in the literary texts in the beginning of the 20th century, we also see an engagement with developments in mathematics at the beginning of the 20th century. So maybe we can group these together for brevity's sake under the keyword of foundational crisis. So in a way, the sense, the fear, and the hope that mathematics might be less certain, less knowable, less complete and consistent than it's often seen, and that it could prove, mathematical proof, so to speak, or at least point to the possibility of greater openness, greater uncertainty and creativity then as well. No, there's a certain danger of overemphasizing that this period in mathematics and the sense of crisis there, but it was a productive period for literature there. Now, my question here is, the first 2 examples refer to fairly general characteristics of mathematics, of rationality and certainty here. And the third category, if you will, is a much more historically specific. These texts refer to mathematical developments in the beginning of the 20th century. My question now is how you see, or how far you see, the negotiation of mathematics in critical theory that you talked about as based on that specific historical moment in mathematics. So you made a case for locating it in the historical context of rising Nazism and totalitarianism, how far do you think we also need to take into account that specific history in mathematics, the historical moment of math in the beginning of the 20th century?
Thanks. That's a great question, and I think you hit on a lot of important points that come up. Most of all, the idea that I think this is worth saying just right off the bat, that mathematics, maths, as they say in the English context, is often a shorthand and often refers to sort of the quantitative numbers, that branch of mathematical thinking, which is of course only one of the various branches of mathematical thinking, of which you're aware. And of course there's different engagements with different moments of mathematical thinking, both in terms of topics, but also in terms of histories of mathematics that happen, I think, sort of adjacently to the Frankfurt School. What I notice in terms of how far this negotiation in critical theory goes for the specific historic moment, I think that they take logical positivism and they take sort of the image of mathematics within logical positivism that they associate with these modernizing names, whether it's Russell or who else, or Carnap, et cetera, all those folks, Frege, et cetera. I see them ultimately flattening the history of mathematics so that these are all expressions of similar tendencies. And I mean, I think this is within sort of the very specific argument that Horkheimer and Adorno make in Dialectic of Enlightenment. I think this links up sort of ahistorically to Galileo, to the early Greeks, to sort of the religion of numbers, and all of that, all of those moments. But I think that what's more interesting is if you can open up, and look to figures like Kracauer, you start to get a sense of this more general texture of mathematics, that it not only applies to sort of this very academic foundations debate within mathematics itself, but it also has to do with very practical mathematical modes of drafting and of the projective geometry that architects learn, as well as then, images of mathematics. Euclidean geometry largely comes from, or Kracauer's work on it largely comes from his work on Husserl. And so it also exists within this larger philosophical debate that's going on at the time. So I think there's a trend to flatten that history, but I think that if you look to other figures, it opens it up and it takes on a little bit greater depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Before we go to the first comment, I'd just like to follow up on one of your trains of thought there as well, because one of the aims, if I understood you correctly, is to challenge the image of mathematics in critical theory, but also a little bit more broadly. And so you were arguing for revisiting critical theory to refashion the image of mathematics, so to speak. But there would be another way, an alternative way, or additional way, I guess, to tackle the image of mathematics outside critical theory. So changing the image of mathematics, not only in critical theory, but more broadly. And I wondered whether you would say that the Adorno-Horkheimer image of mathematics is the predominant one today, and what the role of areas outside of critical theory might be to change the image of mathematics that then feeds back into critical theory.
That's a really good question. I think to a certain extent, it's difficult, especially difficult in that we all come from very different institutions, countries in which these places have in which these concepts have different meaning. And I mean, I don't I think what I was trying to say, specifically for critical theory, is the idea of refashioning. I think that the idea that critical theory has brought to sort of an academic discourse of aesthetics and of sort of modernist studies writ large, especially within the United States, very much focuses on this image of mathematics that comes from the that comes from texts like dialectic to the positivism debate all the way back into the 1930s. And I think one of the things that would be helpful in doing that, well, I guess what I'm dancing around here a little bit of the question is, like I said, I don't want to, in rehabilitating this image of mathematics, I don't want to fall back into some sort of naive positivism where we say, you know, mathematics has all of these tools that will solve all of our problems. I don't want to find technological answers for technological problems. I don't think that that's the answer at all. But I mean, I would be curious and would wonder to what extent then this image of math is shared by the larger population, and say that within specifically academia, I think it would be important to what's the right word? To show that there are more critical ways of engaging with mathematics than we've been told. And I think that this happens on a lot of different levels and in a lot of different disciplines. I think, as you've shown in your book, it happens certainly with modernist literature. And I think it happens within the sphere of critical theory and German Jewish thought as well. Yeah, I think that would be one way of sort of trying to change this image so that people can have a more capacious engagement with mathematics and mathematical related questions.
Okay, thank you. Great. Questions are coming in, and I'll read out the first question by Sasha Freiberg. Congratulating you on your great talk, first of all, and then the questions are connected. Since I am working with people from critical AI studies on the concept of interpretability of AI, where the black box problem is a big issue, wouldn't Kracauer's idea of projection not translate nicely as visualization, as a plea for making visible relations in terms of diagrams, from the binary to the topological, so to say, to enable people to make their own inferences as peers would have it? And did you ever work on similar topics?
This is, I'm laughing because I believe I spoke about this the last time I was in Germany in 2009 in slightly different terms. But I think that one of the ways I think this is exactly the road that I'm trying to go down, and say that the projection does make a nice way to talk about things that are ultimately otherwise sort of unvisualizable or inexpressible, at least as some sort of metaphor or some sort of way of pointing towards them. I think one of the drawbacks to Kracauer's idea is that it sort of relies heavily on a representational theory of knowledge, and to a certain extent, I wonder if we can apply that to to something like black boxes. But I think that the idea as such of either making these algorithmic processes or data-driven processes visible is the impetus, and illuminating them, and this idea of illumination is exactly the point that Kracauer is going for, and I think exactly the contemporary relevance that Sasha points to here. I hopefully will have something coming out on anti-Semitism and Twitter in the future, which draws on actually Horkheimer and Adorno in these cases. This case, and shows sort of some of the potential of their working through some of these ideas. Anti-Semitism specifically as it relates to artificial intelligent chatbots. If you're familiar with it, you might know probably the one that I'm talking about. But Microsoft's Tay, which famously descended into anti-Semitism very quickly after being hijacked by internet trolls.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking at another comment here. I think a bullet point comment further down saying by Johannes Riedner saying visibility, Kracauer's theory of love. And another bullet point comment, geometry, not algebra, uncomparable number elements, dangers of abstraction. Do you want to comment on these suggestions?
Sure, especially because I just read Sichtbarkeit, Kracauers Liebeslehre, which is the Helmut Leighton article that I believe Johannes is referring to here. And yeah, I mean, I think exactly this point of transparency and being able to look into black boxes, to the extent to which one can do that, is of course something that I do not have the expertise for. And I think this is exactly also where Johannes writes a geometry, not algebra, exactly the type of difference I'm working for. I wonder to what extent one can translate between sort of the concrete visuality of something like projection and geometry and sort of the abstraction and sort of syntactical nature or syntactical texture of algebra. And I think this is exactly where one would start to have to do further thinking, and where I think Kracauer sort of points us in the way of doing this, but where we would have to figure out ourselves, whether this is, as the first comment mentioned, sort of mapping the pathways that that inform neural networks, or sort of data visualization itself. I think is yet to be determined.
Right. Let's go on to Sasha Freiberg's second question, saying, I have another question referring to Nina's question as well. In how far did Horkheimer and Adorno connect or model the topic of abstraction and alienation? I just would like to know your thoughts on this. So connect or model the topics of abstraction and alienation in Horkheimer and Adorno's thought.
It's a really good question. Sorry, I'm not looking out into outer, well, I am looking out into outer space, but trying to think of an answer. I think that to a certain extent, I mean, I think that the two are definitely related. And if you look at what they write about sort of thought self-alienation, I think this falls into I think they both connect it and muddle it, to tell you the truth, in the sense that in the ability to extract, the ability to think, one has this distancing motion that distances thought from itself, distances nature from itself, as they would say at the end of the first chapter in Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I think they see that type of alienation and abstraction as both sort of a necessary process, but also as this moment of alienation that is imminent to the process of thinking itself. And I think that those two things sort of go hand in hand within their thought. Of course, I think that that abstraction and alienation sort of refer specifically to different types of distancing. One being sort of more of a physical alienation from something, and the other being more of a cognitive process. But yeah, that's a great question. Thanks.
The next question is by Susan Neiman. First, thanking you for the lecture, and then a couple of questions. Did Adorno and Horkheimer realize that Carnap, Schlick, Neurath, etc. thought they were fighting fascism? Of course, the efforts now look laughable, but did critical theory at least acknowledge the efforts? Maybe let's stick with that first question and tackle them one by one. So.
Sure, they did, and there's a lot of wonderful material in Andrea's article, as well as in the book Positivismusstreit, as well as in Horkheimer and Adorno's and Horkheimer's letters to other members of the Frankfurt School that talk about this. But sorry, I'm trying to remember the words. I think at one point when Horkheimer is told that the Vienna Circle are also victims of the Nazis and also in exile, and also worked practically against fascism in Austria and Germany, that he said, of course, it was they were all brave Antifaschisten, but that it nonetheless didn't matter. It was the mode of thought that held to sort of the apology of the status quo, Apologie des Bestehenden, that itself was sort of the most dangerous, and if anything, then just negated their own own political efforts. So yes, they were aware of this, but I don't think it seemed to matter.
Mm. The second question, actually, something I wondered about as well. Second question by Susan Neyman saying, Adorno and Horkheimer's critique was not just against math and not even against instrumental reason, though they said it was, but against the Enlightenment as a whole. What place exactly do you think math plays in that more general critique?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this, so thank you for the question. In the sense that I think you see a lot of parallels in the way that a text like Dialectic of Enlightenment unfolds with various different readings of this movement from Enlightenment back to mythology. And the way that I've come to read it and tried to teach it is that clearly they have certain sort of historical markers or quasi-historical markers that they work on. And there's Odysseus, there's Kant comes up, there's the actual process of myth and mimesis, and sort of those early moments of enlightenment, which of course comes before Kant, but I didn't mention the writer here. And then the way that I see it is that sort of the new positivism or the new logic, the latest logic, which I don't think they ever specifically refer to the Vienna Circle in the book, but that always serves as sort of this personification of enlightenment throughout the text. So I think that it has the function of both being sort of exemplary, but also giving, sort of showing the most latest manifestation of their critique. And I think as sort of this translation into the more real and more historically contemporary criticisms of technology, of technologicized mass murder, of industrial capitalism, of the culture industry, of this idea of calculation, of calculating desire and then reproducing it, etc. So I think it both serves as an exemplary moment and then as sort of the present exemplary moment within that larger critique of enlightenment.
I think there is just a follow-up question that goes along with this. So no, I think we'll keep the order. It's a slightly different topic. So I think more prudent to stick with the order that we have and address Andrea Albrecht's question next. Thank you, Matt, she writes, for the nice talk, which reminded me in a good way of our first discussion in Freiburg. It seems to me that we were much further apart then than we are now, but I have a very different question today. I'm currently dealing with a representative of logical empiricism who makes a small attempt to integrate aesthetic aspects of the world into theory. The mathematician Richard von Mises wrote in a 1939 paper that the literary use of language has purposes other than that of communication or Mitteilung. It sounds like Benjamin. And consequently, you find logic and poetry in language in a particular entanglement. Do you know how to integrate that into your panorama? Is von Mises perhaps a counterfigure to Kracauer, showing us away from logical positivism to aesthetics?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Andrea. Thank you. I think it relates to von Mises actually comes up, I think, in an Adorno criticism in Negative Dialectics, where he criticizes Carnap and Mises in comparison to Hegel and Kant. So just, sorry, a factual thing there. I think this is a part of the project that I haven't necessarily explored and would really be interested in doing. But looking at it in terms of if Kracauer tries to push the bridge from aesthetics to logic, trying to push the bridge the other way from logic or logical positivism back to aesthetics. One of the ways that I think, one of the ways that I don't necessarily have a way of integrating this into my panorama, except for saying that it's sort of a coming philosophy in the words of Benjamin, but to say that it seems that the cyberneticians of the post-war era might have a way of talking more specifically about this. And I'm just thinking of people that you've worked on in terms of Max Benzer, and those folks in the small volume Mathematik und Dichtung from the 1970s, I believe. And one of the questions I think here is to say, what would be a logical way to talk about aesthetics that doesn't necessarily talk about aesthetics purely through quantitative means? And I think this is an open question within the larger, and I promised Francisca I wouldn't say this, but the digital humanities, that I think would be a much more fruitful engagement between the two spheres of knowledge that I think we have seen in the past. One of the ways that I would think about this would maybe be in looking at logical constructions of aesthetic arguments, to see logic itself as an aesthetic feature, as something that itself can be pleasing or rewarding, or disgusting and ugly, depending on what one's aesthetics are. But like I said, I think that this question still needs a lot of thinking to be able to answer.
And Andrea Albrecht wrote to clarify that there are two von Miseses. There's the philosopher Ludwig, and then there is her guy Richard, and she guesses that Adorno only knows Ludwig. And as one comment. Another comment by Johannes Riedner, who says there is the chance to further discuss Kracauer's thought in a Kracauer conference in Frankfurt that you can up. Yeah, and Andrea Albrecht suggesting further work on comparing the thoughts of Richard von Mises and Kracauer. That maybe brings up a question that I had as well, not maybe the counterfigures to Kracauer. So what Andrea Albrecht suggested, seeing maybe von Mises as a counterfigure to Kracauer, but as his companions in the project or your project to create an alternative or think about an alternative to the Adorno Horkheimer trend in critical theory. So I know that in your book you have Kracauer as one of your case studies, but can I invite you to relatively briefly, of course, talk about other examples of that alternative tradition in critical theory that you make up?
Sure. Thank you. So the book tries to chart a larger relationship between sort of cultural theory, cultural thinking, and a lot of these German Jewish thinkers, and locates, in order to locate sort of a more emancipatory potential in mathematics than Horkheimer and Adorno obviously ascribed to it. So at points I look at Solomon Maimon as an early commentator on Kant and on especially the infinitesimal in Kant's work, as well as, fast forwarding to one of the more major chapters is on Gershom Scholem. And I think this is actually, what I think about Scholem is the most interesting, that he knew the most of sort of this very productive time in mathematical history of the Grundlagenkrise. Reading authors like Poincaré and Hilbert, and himself getting a Staatsexamen in mathematics from Munich in 1921. He was going to, he of course gives that up to write a dissertation on a linguistic theory of Kabbalah, but one can already see the similarities there. In that I tried to trace a similar, in that chapter I tried to trace a similar arc between Schollem's work in logic and language, and actually specifically mathematical logic, as this mode of restricting and of boiling down language to its most specific symbolic and quote unquote meaningless parts, and that actually, and ultimately through this term silence, becomes an aesthetic mode for poetry. And this might actually be a better answer to Andrea's question, and it'd be interesting. Schollem might have been out of the game already by the time von Mises was around, but he uses this theory of silence, or this idea of silence, and he says basically the only way to be able to complete a system of mathematical logic is if there was some other way that things could communicate. It's obviously in close conversation with Benjamin here, beyond, in silence, beyond sort of this realm of the Lautsprache. And he sees that connection as sort of as a difficult, as the place in which some of the paradoxes start coming up within mathematical logic. But he translates that then into a theory of translation that he uses to translate some of the Hebrew Bible in his early years. And he comes up with a sort of aesthetics of silence, in which, and aesthetics of non-meaning, and aesthetics that tries to strip away the meaning of everyday language and the meaning of poetic language, as a sign, not necessarily of these things directly, but as a sign of the inexpressibility of the things that are being lamented in the Hebrew Bible: exile, destruction of Jerusalem, etc. This is, towards the end of this chapter, I sort of make this gesture, but I think it bears mentioning that I see this move, this sort of negative history of this negative version of history as sort of calamity and as disaster and as silence, as modes of falling silent, as a contribution and in a way to thinking through how does one understand a Jewish history that for Schollem is that of disaster. And he does this, he doesn't do it through mathematics. He ultimately obviously returns to mysticism, but mysticism sort of plays the mirror image where mathematics closes down on language. Mysticism is the overproduction of language and the overproduction of symbolism. And I could really go into a lot of this, but won't. But there's a lot of connections here with debates in mathematical Platonism that happen, a lot of debates with sort of the questions raised about mathematics as both the most certain and also the most difficult language or mode of studying that ultimately motivate him to study it and to sort of bring it into this larger context.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, covered quite a lot of ground. Thank you. We're looking at the next question by Burak Sezer. Hello, Alice. Thanks for your great talk. He writes and says, my question is this: the quantification criticized by Horkheimer and Adorno seems to be related intimately to a very finite understanding of mathematics. How does the introduction of infinity play into mathematics as enlightenment? Is it counter-enlightenment, especially because it cannot be usurped by a worldly rationalizing mathematics?
This is a good question, and I think there is, finite might be one way to say it, discrete might be another way to say it, in terms of that it seems to be sort of a very what's the right way to say it? Finite, related to numbers, and related to numbers sort of not in the more complex ways that we know that that number theory and things like that actually work. I think that infinity plays a couple of roles, and I think there's a lot of different ways that infinity plays in here. I'm thinking of something I read in college. More is the infinite, just in terms of looking at this question of the infinite throughout, in the long purview. I see infinity here functioning both as a I think there's two different answers to this. I see infinity playing the role of something that needs mathematics in order to be able to speak about it, and needs something then, mathematics, not necessarily in mathematics itself as intuitive, but mathematics as mathematics as a metaphor. So something that is able to take something that's otherwise hard or impossible to imagine and giving it a name, giving it a symbolization. I don't think it stands sort of outside of a worldly rationalizing. I think here, so I think that would be one way that sort of mathematics and the infinite of mathematics as enlightenment could be able to function. I think to a certain extent, it functions as a counter-enlightenment, or it would function as a counter-enlightenment. I think that it would be to channel someone like Adorno or Horkheimer here, especially Adorno, that it would be something that would align on the side of astrological thinking, or of New Age things that they criticize as within sort of the context of the larger culture industry, or as within the dialectics of myth and enlightenment. I think there's also another one, and this relates to Benjamin's work on infinity, and specifically his work on Cantor and the Russell's paradox and elements like that. And I think there's this then sort of points to this level of mathematics as a language, and it's sort of the arbitrariness of its designation, which Benjamin works out in early fragments. And I think one place to look further for something like this would be Peter Fenvis's book on the Messianic reduction. I think he talks about it there. But I would really say that I think I don't think it necessarily serves as a counter-enlightenment, but it can also serve as an enlightenment. Mathematics could serve as an enlightenment here in terms of being able to render something legible that's otherwise illegible. I think that's a lot of what this use of mathematics actually revolves around in figures like Scholem and Kracauer.
Yeah, thank you. We're coming back to Susan Neumann's question, how in the world do you teach dialectic of enlightenment? When I did so, I kept running up against undergraduates at good university, concluding that Kant equals Sade.
This is a very good question, and one that I would also implore anyone, if they have an answer to be able to say. I teach it largely to graduate students, which sometimes helps. I also only will teach a selective reading, which I will admit, of especially the concept of enlightenment in the culture industry, and the theses on anti-Semitism. But it is difficult to keep them from falling into, are they saying science is bad? And you're like, no, it's more important than that. I find that what helps is a lot of preparation with a lot of reading of Hegel and some Lukács and others beforehand. But also then this, just focusing on the key moment of dialectic of enlightenment as a dialectic in which myth and enlightenment already contain each other. That's sort of the key kernel of knowledge that they read to take away from it. That's a great question, though.
Maybe as a final question, looking at the time where it's almost up, and it's a sort of question from the left field as well. So I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to ask it or not, but I think I'll try and you decide whether you want to answer it or not. It's an acknowledgement that both of us are coming at this topic from the humanities, and one of the ideas, well, you're talking about the relation between the sciences, mathematics, and the humanities there. So can I invite you to either speculate or talk about your experiences of what a mathematician might have to say about these topics? But feel free to keep to silence as well if you're tired of being asked that question.
I have had very productive conversations with colleagues who, in philosophy, who are aware of some of the debates and work through similar people, be it Frege or logical positivists or folks like that. I find that I think that philosophically inclined mathematicians are the best people to talk about this. And one of the things that one has to be careful of is to not make over and generalizing statements about mathematics. I think it's hard to say what they would think about it, but I guess what I could say is that I would hope they would think that this would be a contribution to a larger conversation between mathematics and culture that they hopefully also see their discipline as playing a part in. And that for those people that are working on things that have more real life effects in the real world, be those computer engineering or computer science more type people, that there are critical tools that these people offer in order to be able to talk about mathematics effects in the real world that they might want, that they should hopefully at least give some credence to and pay attention to, because I think that a lot of the problems that even in the most basic sense that Horkheimer and Adorno diagnosed in the 1940s, we're confronting them today. And I don't think just building smarter machines will ever finish that problem. But I think it an answer to that question ultimately rests in an interdisciplinary conversation of a table of not only mathematicians and computer scientists, but also people who can interpret culture and people who know things about language and aesthetics. So I go for the more big tent, hope for the more big tent approach here.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Andrea Albrecht says that at least her husband, a mathematician, is outraged, but says hi anyway. So the conversation can continue.
Hi back.
Right, enough for me. Thank you very much, Matthew. And I give back to Franziska Bomsky now.
So, yeah, first let me say thank you to both of you for a wonderful talk, for a wonderful discussion, and especially the last question reminded me a few weeks ago we had a big conference on interdisciplinarity, and this would have been a great topic for this also. Of course, we had also like does it work, does it not work? Maybe we could have tested it with that. But it's been a long evening, a very lively evening. Thank you again to you both. Thank you to the audience for listening, for discussing with us. And let me just hint at our next event, which is next Tuesday. The event will be held in German, and we will have Bernd Greiner talking about Henry Kissinger. And maybe you're interested in that, and you're all very much invited to join us again. And that's it for today. Have a very nice evening and see you hopefully soon.